Not many days had passed when another Sudanese family, living close by, had invited them to a marriage celebration feast. By then, Samira was considered as part of the widow's family and thus, warranted an invitation. Her two helpers, Mona and Rose, were automatically invited too. It was a custom in all over Sudan that women were invited by women and the men, by their counterparts. In the event of a wedding, circumcision, and alzar dance, 2 or 3 young girls would be sent by the family concerned to extend invitations to all the women in the area. Likewise, 2 young boys would be tasked with distributing invitation cards to the men. Each woman would be invited verbally, while every man would receive a beautiful invitation card. When the 2 girls, known as the inviters, appeared to invite the 5 women, they did not mention the name of Samir Ahmed. Wherefore, on the day of the wedding only the 5 invited women went to attend the happy occasion. Samira was truly enjoyed the wedding celebration. She liked the bridegroom and his lovely bride. She did not notice anything unusual about the newly wedded couple, which might remotely suggest spousal abuse. Salwa announced that the bride was 16 years old and her bridegroom was 25. They were first cousins. In Islam, it is entirely normal and lawful for first cousins to wed. It was, of course, the first Sudanese wedding Samira had the privilege to attend. Before attending that wedding, she heard stories of underage girls being married to men as old as their fathers or grandfathers. She herself was a victim of child marriage. This wedding seemed to run counter to her long-standing belief that the majority of Muslim girls were given in marriages to men much older than them. Inwardly, she hoped that she would see more weddings of the sort in Muslim societies. Unfortunately, that wonderful experience shattered on the 3rd wedding night for the couple. The 3rd night is referred to as the night of entering or penetrating. Essentially, it is the night the marriage is consummated. The bridegroom would not be allowed to take his bride out of her father's house until he slept with her and confirmed that she was a virgin and that he was the first man to deflower her. That alone wasn't enough. The bride also should prove to her family, in-laws, relatives, and all neighbors that she was unquestionably a virgin, and that she was deflowered against her wishes by her bridegroom. So, how does one furnish proof of virginity to the crowd outside the bedroom? In some backward Arab tribes that matter could be solved by a white handkerchief the bridegroom would use to prove the virginity of his bride. He would wrap the hanky around his finger and insert it in the bride's vagina and break her hymen. After that, he would come out and show the blood-smeared handkerchief to all people. And through that stupid custom he would prove to that entire gathering of relatives, neighbors, and friends he was the first one to finger his bride and break her seal. Nevertheless, that silly practice was not acceptable to the relatively cultured Sudanese people. We will now visit the process of confirmation of virginity for the people of Sudan. It so happened, on that particular night of entering for the newly married couple, Samira was in deep sleep when she was suddenly jarred awake by the screams of a girl at about 12:30 a.m. At that hour, in the still hours of the morning, the shouting continued like a fire alarm, on and on. It drove the sleep away from Samir and Samira and filled their hearts with fear. At first, Samira thought that the screaming was coming from the house of the 3 rival wives. But, Samir pointed out that it was coming from the house of the newly wedded couple. It was also the adjoining house in the opposite direction. Samir's first reaction was to call 911. Remembering that he was in Sudan and that there wasn't a 911 number to call, nor was there a phone, he prodded Samira to hurry to Salwa and Sakina's hut and find out what was going on. Samira ran first to the hut of her interpreter and asked her to come quickly with her. Like 2 persons being chased by an invisible force, the 2 girls rushed towards the women's section. It was a moonless pitch-dark night. They could not see in front of them. Samira relied on her memory to find her way. Like fired bullets they forced their way into the biting cold breeze of the night and entered the women's section. Samira did not knock or wait for someone to let her in. She just pushed open the small door of the hut, followed by her interpreter. Without light, the hut was pitch dark and the two widows were fast sleeping and snoring like the sleepers of the cave. Like a cat trying to find her way in a dark kitchen, Samira groped her way inside the dark hut. The first person she came upon was Sakina. When the old woman was sufficiently awake, Samira told her that there was a girl shouting for help because someone wanted to kill her or rape her. Sakina responded calmly by first lighting her lamp. Then, she looked at Samira and examined her face carefully to find out whether she was awake, hallucinating, or reeling from a bad nightmare. After that, she listened for a few minutes to the screaming of the girl in question. The old woman smiled before she opened her mouth to talk. She told Samira, it was the bride whose wedding they had attended a couple of days ago. She was screaming because her man was trying to do it to her and she wasn't supposed to allow him to do it to her. Then, Sakina laughed and said, he is going to do it to her anyhow. Just go back to your husband, my daughter, and put a pillow on your ears and sleep. Samira returned to her husband and related what the old woman had told her. Neither of them could make out why the bride would resist the advances of her lawful husband, or why he had to take her by force. Both of them remained awake, in part guaranteed by the continued shouting of the bride, which continued for at least an hour and a half. Early the following morning, Samira woke Salwa and asked her whether she had heard the screaming of the bride last night. Salwa said she had heard it, but she put a pillow over her ears and resumed her sleep. Also, she repeated the same words, Sakina said last night. Samira insisted that Salwa should explain to her in more details that strange custom which seemed to be okay for everyone except her husband and her. Salwa began by saying shyly that she herself screamed and fought against her husband on their first wedding night and did not allow him to do it to her until he did it by force. According to her, it is a required custom that every new bride must resist and fight against her bridegroom over her virginity and strive hard not to allow him to have sex with her until he would do it by force, legal rape. The custom required that the bridegroom should try through all means available to him to force his bride to yield to his sexual desire. This results in the first night being a tooth and nail fight and struggle between the groom and the bride. In general, at midnight, the bride would be led by a few young girls to a hut or room in which her bridegroom would be eagerly waiting for her. The girls would lock the room up from without and leave. As soon as the bridegroom was sure that the door was securely locked up and all windows were shut, he would attack her. The bride would start running around in circles inside the hut and screaming as loudly as she could. The bride, obviously, knew that no one would respond to her calls. He would begin chasing her around the hut as the cock chases its hen or the dog its bitch. She would jump on the bed, he would jump after her. She would jump off the bed and he would follow her. She might stumble over a chair or stool and fall, but she would get up quickly and resume her running and screaming, for it was what was expected of her. When the bridegroom succeeded in catching his bride, then the real fight would begin. It would not be a small fight, but a real one in which each of them would apply full strength. The bride would fight hands, legs, and teeth. She would scratch, kick, hit, and bite the body of her bridegroom. The bridegroom's job would be much harder than his bride's. In addition to his self-defense, he was supposed to undress his bride. He had to tear her clothes off her body piece after piece. Though he might succeed in stripping her fully naked, he still had to face the difficulty of forcing her to yield to his sexual desire. Meanwhile, the bride would continue to scream and fight and defend her virginity until the last soldier she had keeled over. It is conceivable that a groom be able to force his bride to give up her struggles and yield to his physical superiority. But he would still have one more hurdle. To understand this last difficulty, we need to recollect our earlier foray into female genital mutilation. As we already mentioned, the circumcised girl's vagina would be so sealed and narrowed until it would be reduced to a small hole allows the girl only to urinate. The hole would be a little bigger than an eye of a needle. Intercourse would simply be impossible. It is just like locking up the girl's vagina or putting a secure lock on her private parts. The pre-Islamic Arabs used to fashion underwear made out of iron and place them around the private parts of their women. The iron underwear was called hizam al-ifa, the belt of honor. If and when their women were taken captives, the captors might not be able to rape them. The same primitive idea passed on to Muslims and practiced today in more evil way through the female genital mutilation. Instead of putting those iron underwears and locking them up, in Islam locks are placed on the girls' vaginas. Moreover, in Islam by removing the girl's clitoris, labia majora, and labia minora her sexual organ will be destroyed and mutilated to the point that she loses all desire for sex. Some Muslims argue that those private parts, which the midwife excises during the circumcision, will grow again. This is not true. The clitoris and 2 labias will never grow again. On her first wedding night, the bride will experience terrible pain and feels as if she is raped by her bridegroom. In many cases, bridegrooms could not able to penetrate until their brides were taken to the hospital. In fact, the small hole that was left open would not allow the bridegroom even to insert his finger. An erected man's phallus would be too big to go through such small opening. Those brides would undergo surgeries to widen their vaginas so that their bridegrooms could have normal sex with them. Sometimes, the fear of being labeled impotent or gays drives them to attempt everything to effect penetration. There are cases when the bridegrooms used knives to widen their brides' vaginas. Before we dismantle the morals behind this custom, we should explore its consequences. In so many cases, the wedding night of the honeymoon ends up with admission to the hospital with serious injuries, not only to the bride, but also to the bridegroom. Sometimes, the bride might be healthy and stronger than her bridegroom. Cases of brides breaking hands or legs of their husbands are not unheard of. In some rare cases, the bridegrooms were the ones screaming for help. If there are no morals behind such bizarre custom, then we might conclude that it was taken from beasts. Firstly, the bride's resistance is supposed to prove to all and sundry that she was brought so strictly and correctly that even her bridegroom would not be allowed violate her. In other words, there was no acceptable way to have sex with her except by utmost force. Secondly, by screaming she would prove to her family, in-laws, relatives, and neighbors that she is a good girl and that she abhors sex. Thirdly, she would prove to her husband and all present that she is indeed a virgin. This last claim would be verified by her mother-in-law and her mother through examining the blood stain on the bed sheets the following morning. The blood stain would be a clear proof that she was virgin and her hymen had been broken only by her bridegroom. Fourth, through her yelling and wailing she would announce how painful sex was for her because she was circumcised, sealed, zipped, zapped, and securely closed up. That midnight episode served to erode whatever respect the American couple had for Sudanese Muslims, men as well as women. They could not fathom how rational and moral human beings whom God created in His image and endowed with intellect, reason, and conscience could be so ignorant in their thinking and allow such evil practices under the guise of good customs. Samir and Samira simply consider it rape. Even ancient primitive tribes such as the barbarians of Europe, the animists of Africa, and the savages of the Americas did not stoop to that level. Many primitives actually had very advanced societies. Both knew that there was simply nothing they could do. Their only recourse was to expose those practices upon their return to their homeland. The following day, Sakina announced that the bride was taken to the hospital late night due to the excessive bleeding from her privates. Salwa added that the bleeding was the result of her husband's attempts with a pair of scissors. Samir, hearing about it later, simply concluded that they were either mentally retarded due to the culture of shame imposed on them through the misogynistic teachings of Islam or that they were a sick society that needed an outside assistance. He believed that the changes would not come from within, but from without. Samira was convinced that anyone in America or anywhere else, after learning about these abuses, would still say that Muslim women are not oppressed, but of the opinion that perpetrator was abusive or mentally challenged.